Welcome to the latest edition of Freedom Matters. My name's Michael Stead. I'm the Anglican Bishop of South Sydney and I'm the Chair of Freedom for Faith. I'm joined today by Monica Dumit, who's the Chancellor of the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney and also a fellow board member of Freedom for Faith. And our focus today is the Human Rights Bill that's been introduced by the Greens. So we're going to look at that bill and think about what are the implications for religious freedom in particular. The Human Rights Bill was introduced by the New South Wales Greens back in March of 2025. Did nothing for a long time and then was referred to an inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry, in March of this year. And they're now taking submissions, with the submissions closing on the 3rd of July. There are some real challenges in this bill for religious freedom. Monica.
Why would there be challenges for religious freedom in this bill, Bishop Michael? Human rights. Religious freedom is a human right, obviously, and aren't we for human rights? I mean, we're not against them, are we?
No, we're not against human rights. We are against the way that human rights are being protected. So I guess there's two ways of answering the question. The first thing is to say this particular bill is hopeless. It's lopsided in its implementation. It doesn't appropriately implement the human rights that Australia has committed itself to in its international covenants. But before we get to that, and we will mainly focus on that today, there's kind of some fundamental underlying problems which mean human rights bills, more broadly speaking, are suspect ways of implementing human rights. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but human rights bills don't work. I mean, my basic objection to them is that they are ineffective, unnecessary and undemocratic.
That's a big claim.
Okay. Let me see if we can unpack that. Ineffective, basically, they don't work. They don't actually protect human rights. If you look at the jurisdictions in Australia that do have human rights charters, so I'm thinking ACT, Victoria, Queensland, they don't actually achieve human rights. You wouldn't have any particular examples, would you?
Well, I always like, when thinking about human rights acts or charters of rights or whatever they call them, I always like to say to people, let's play a game of how's that working for you?
Yeah.
I mean, Victoria had a Human Rights Act during the COVID lockdowns, and they were the jurisdiction that was most locked down, I think, in the whole world during that time. And none of us will forget, I think, the images of, riot police storming the Queen Victoria markets and things like that. And so it's interesting. I remember the comments at the time saying that the Charter of Rights in Victoria actually worked well during that time. And I don't think anyone who was pepper sprayed for going out for a walk or forcibly vaccinated or something like that would necessarily think that their human rights were upheld during that time. Yeah.
And ACT is another example?
Well, we all know the forcible takeover of the Calvary Catholic Hospital by the ACT government. And again, technically the ACT Human Rights Act or Charter of Rights, whatever it's called, down there protects freedom of religion, but doesn't protect it in a way that can't prevent a government from coming in and just taking a Catholic hospital out from underneath it. Interestingly, we look at jurisdictions around the world too, North Korea has a Human Rights Act. And again, how's that working for you, really? Yeah,
that's right. So I think that you can point to so many examples where human rights acts, human rights charters are just not actually delivering on human rights. So that's my first point. They are ineffective. But more fundamentally, they're actually unnecessary. In Australia, for a long time, we haven't thought we needed to have a human rights charter in order to protect human rights. We've done it in other legislative means. So part of our commitments are rights to non-discrimination, and so we have both federal and state-based anti-discrimination acts that say you can't discriminate on the basis of sex or gender or age or race and things like that. I guess I want to push the point, not only are they unnecessary, they're an unnecessary distraction at this point in time. So are there any areas of discrimination law where we are somewhat suspect at the moment?
Well, if we look, I don't know, here in New South Wales, it's perfectly legal to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their religious belief or activity. So you could walk into a cafe and try to order a coffee and they could say, well, I know that you're an Anglican bishop and so I'm not going to serve you because you're an Anglican. And there would be absolutely nothing that could do about that. If they turned you away because you're a man, then that might be a different story. But if they turned you away because you're an Anglican, absolutely not. Yeah,
and that's because religious discrimination is not a protected attribute in New South Wales, and this human rights bill would not change that. This would not. So instead of fixing the problems which are obviously there, we're passing a piece of unnecessary legislation.
Yeah, because it only protects the attributes that are currently protected in New South Wales under anti-discrimination law, which doesn't include religion, so it's just doubling down on the problem.
Yep. If anything, it's making it worse. And then my last complaint is that these kinds of bills are undemocratic because what they effectively do is they transfer the lawmaking power away from the legislature to the judiciary. We're saying, it's too hard for us to work out how do we actually balance up the sometimes overlapping and competing rights. And so instead of the legislature, who is accountable to the public through a democratic process, we're just handing it over to judges to effectively work it out for themselves. What is that a problem? Is it just me?
Well, because judges aren't elected, right? And so there's no ability to hold them accountable.
Yeah. And it actually compromises their independence as judges because then they become political figures and they have to take sides in these debates. They can't just say, oh, well, it's not my fault. The legislature has created this legislation and all I'm doing is implementing it. Necessarily they're making judgment call, as the name implies, about how they are going to uphold certain rights in certain cases. And so we end up with a very politicised judicial system. And again, show me how that's working for you. You look at the American system, which is the epitome of a politicised judicial system, and I think we don't want to go there. That's the end result of handing these kind of contested matters over to judges. Human rights are politically contested, and what we're doing is we're undermining the judiciary to ask them to make those calls.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the arguments that we often hear in favour of a Charter of Rights or a Bill of Rights is that Australia is the only Western democracy that doesn't yet have a Charter of Rights. And so there's this idea that somehow we're falling behind in the protection of human rights. But interestingly, most of the countries that have Bills of Rights were established before they were independent. So the idea was that when countries were becoming independent from the United Kingdom, that what would happen is that they would have these charters of rights to prevent a communist regime or something like that coming in and taking away the rights of the individual. In this sense, I would say that it's kind of the other way around. We have a Western democracy.
We have a robust system that's actually working. We actually have incredibly good protections for rights on the whole in Australia.
And the Greens are trying to use this to actually undo those protections. But anyway, we'll get into the details of the bill in a second.
Yeah. Well, so they're the big kind of fundamental reasons why I have reactions against the Bill of Rights. I'm not saying that there couldn't possibly be a perfect Bill of Rights somewhere, but I've never seen one, and all the versions that we've seen that have been proposed in Australia are so far short of any kind of standard. So my initial response to any human rights bill is to think, this is probably not a good idea. It's probably going to be ineffective, unnecessary and undemocratic. And
I think that's an important point before we get into the detail of the bill, which we will now, is that I think listeners or viewers of this Freedom Matters podcast, videocast, whatever we're calling it, should know that when you hear campaigns for charters of rights, for a Bill of Rights, for a Human Rights Act, that they should actually twig to that this is potentially a threat to religious freedoms.
That's right. It is coming from the other side of politics. These are particularly pushed with a progressive left agenda. I mean, this particular bill, there's some obvious biases in it. We'll talk about that in a moment. But generally speaking, it's not the religious communities who've been arguing for bills of rights for obvious reasons, that we actually see the ways that these have been used to suppress religion rather than to enhance its freedom.
And certainly some of the big protagonists in the campaign for an Australian Human Rights Act are the same people who were pushing for same-sex marriage back in the early to mid-2000, 2010, around there. Yeah.
This is not friendly to religious freedom.
Yeah.
This is not advocated by people who want to create the maximal expression of religious freedom. This is actually about winding it back.
Absolutely. Well, should we turn to the bill?
Yes, indeed. Let me sketch out the 4 things that the bill does, and then we'll kind of step through each of the parts of the bill. So at a very high level, what does it do? Firstly, it creates 31 enforceable human rights. It recognises certain things as human rights. Now, some of the things are the things that we've traditionally seen recognised as human rights. So if you look at the International Covenant for the Protection of Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, some of the rights that are here are things that we would recognise: freedom of expression, freedom of religion, things like that. But it also has novel rights, and the way that it implements the rights that it does implement are inconsistent with the way that those rights have been set up under covenant. So, but the first thing it does is it sets up a regime of rights, 31 categories of rights. The second thing it does is it creates ways in which these rights are recognised and enforced, and it does it in two ways. First of all, it creates a system of enforcement against public authorities, and public authorities means much more than it sounds like it means, whereby if you are a public authority, you're actually required to make decisions in accordance with human rights, and then people can take you to a tribunal or indeed to a court if they believe that you haven't acted in accordance with these human rights. So it kind of has teeth binding on public authorities. Come back to that. The second thing that it does, it puts a requirement on the courts to interpret all legislation as consistently as possible with these 31 rights, even when, and it says it quite explicitly, even when on the face of it doesn't say that, you have to kind of shoehorn it in to try and make it as consistent as possible with the rights. And so it means that courts will now be able to say, well, that provision now means something different to what the legislature probably meant when they enacted it 20 years ago, because we're now reading it through this lens. It's basically putting a human rights lens over all of the statutory interpretation process. And then the last big thing that it does is it creates oversight and enforcement bodies. It creates a new New South Wales Human Rights Commission with extraordinary powers to compel information, and we'll get to the details of that. It also creates a new parliamentary oversight committee so that every piece of legislation that comes to the parliament now needs to be put through the same kind of overarching grid of human rights. So there's the big scope of what's involved. New rights, two ways of recognising and enforcing them, one against public authorities, one through the courts, and then a complaints body, a Human Rights Commission, New South Wales Human Rights Commission, as well as a parliamentary oversight body.
I don't know what you're so worried about. I mean, the best thing for human rights is always more bureaucracy.
Absolutely. What we need is more people and a complaints mechanism in order to enforce human rights. And look how well it's working with so many other parts of our society. But let's look at detail, because I think that the devil is in the detail, no pun intended, and particularly the way that it sets up its framework of these 31 enforceable rights, because it is anything but neutral, anything but an impartial implementation of internationally accepted rights. Do you want to articulate some of that?
Yeah, sure. So, we've got these 31 rights that include things like freedom of thought, conscience and belief, education, housing, health, clean water, all of these types of things. And obviously somebody can't enjoy all of those rights simultaneously. There has to be some limits on your exercise of rights.
Yep.
But one of the interesting things that this bill does is, instead of copying international human rights instruments that have very specific limitations clauses and limitations depending on which right they're talking about. So, for example, we know that international human rights instruments only allow limitation of freedom of religion in very specific circumstances and very narrow circumstances. And then other rights that are deemed to be, let's say, less fundamental to the human person can be limited in more broader ways. But what this bill does is, instead of treating each individual right as specific and being able to rank them in terms of priority or importance, they just have this general limitations clause, and it says something along the lines of, hold on, here we go. It's about that rights can be subject to reasonable limits that are demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society based on human dignity, equality and freedom.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, when we hear words like equality and, dignity and things like that, while they are very good words, at the same time we know they've been hijacked. They've been hijacked by the Dying with Dignity mob when we're talking about end-of-life care. They've been hijacked by the same-sex marriage groups when we're talking about equality and things like that. And so all of a sudden, if you get judges or members of tribunals who are here trying to interpret these laws, they say, well, in a democratic society based on equality and dignity, how should I decide this? It's incredibly subjective.
Yeah. That's right. And so in order to limit a right, you just have to say it's demonstrably justified in accordance with that kind of those overarching principles. That standard is much, much lower, as you say, than the reasons why you would limit a right under international covenants. And so the international covenant it's only if it's necessary in order to protect the fundamental rights, freedoms of others. Here it's demonstrably justified if it upholds certain other principles. You can hear there's a world of difference between those things. Here's, pardon me, your earlier point was that the ICCPR has bespoke limitations depending on the different rights. So let me sketch it out. At its highest level, the right to thought, conscience and belief, the right to hold a religious belief is unlimitable. It's non-derogable. So you can't put any limits on it. I can't say you can't believe that thing. There are, whereas under this Act, the government could say it is illegal to practice a particular religion, to have a religious belief. We're going to outlaw. I won't name a religion, but you could say, this is just so outrageous, you can't be an X in Australia. Under international law, you cannot do that. Article 18 says that you can't put that's a non-derogable right. The manifestation of a right, yes, you could say you can't do certain things associated with the religion, and the limit there would be the government can do that if it's necessary to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, necessary being the key word. But here, the government could outlaw a religion on the basis of that clause. If they say it's necessary because it's justified because of what it does to the dignity and equality of other people, we're going to outlaw it.
And it's not even the government we're talking about, right? The government passes a bill like this and what you get are judges who can just, on their definition of what it means to be equal or free or dignified, they could just actually say, you know what, from my view and from where I'm sitting, that particular religious belief or practice isn't in accordance with human dignity, inequality or things like that. And
then there's nothing we can do about it because you can't vote the judge out because they're unelected officials.
Yeah, extraordinary. It gives them extraordinary power and very difficult for legislative change too, because then what are you doing? You're going to Parliament asking them to remove words like equality and dignity.
That's right. And then that will get referred back to a parliamentary committee who's required to interpret, and they'll say, well, the judge has said that that act is inconsistent, and so, we're going to get stuck with terrible laws.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, in addition to this problem with the general limitations clause, and a number of points during the Act, it quite deliberately and explicitly elevates the right to non-discrimination above other rights. And so for a number of other rights, it says, brackets, in accordance with the right to non-discrimination, as though this becomes the pinnacle right. And so it's very clear that whenever there's going to be a contest between the right to non-discrimination and the right to exercise of religion, the Act consistently comes down on the right to non-discrimination. And so there's just an inherent bias. As I said, this is not an ideologically pure bill. This is leaning left.
Yeah, so that the primary right is non-discrimination. Even, I think, above the right to life.
That's right.
Which is extraordinary.
In fact, this doesn't recognise the right to life. So it says that the human rights only start at the point of birth, and so the rights of the unborn child, they don't exist. And so it's quite explicitly not that there is no right to life of an unborn child, because human rights only begin at the point at which you are born.
Extraordinary.
It is. But I guess not only is it flawed in its conception with general limitations clause, and not only does it have this inherent bias towards non-discrimination, there's also quite explicit failures to implement the ICCPR model, both by protecting rights which are not in the ICCPR, not protecting rights which are in the ICCPR, and then doing rights but in a way that subtly modifies or changes the standard for ICCPR. Now, there's lots of examples. The notes will have all the details, but we might just sketch out some of them. So any examples come to mind of the way that it doesn't, that it implements novel rights?
Well, rights like the right to, I think, clean water or
that's right.
or things like that, or nutritious food or something like that, which we all agree are good things, but what does it mean to have a right to those things? Does it mean that someone needs to be providing those things to you? It's got a right to housing, and again, we want everybody to have housing, but what does that mean in terms of placing an obligation on a public authority? And we'll come back to what a public authority means.
Yeah.
What does that mean that in reality and in sort of concrete examples, what does that mean that somebody has to do? I don't know if you've got any other rights.
I mean, that one's worth exploring because it shows both the frightening part of this Act as well as its limitations. So it does create a right to public housing. A very similar provision in the ACT was relied upon by those people in public housing who the Public Housing Authority was saying, we actually want to redevelop this whole area because we've got small public housing and we want to build lots of public housing for lots more people. And the three people said, no, we refuse to be provided with other housing. We have a right to stay in this house, this public house that's been provided to us. And they won.
Wow.
And so the whole development was stalled because three people took that public authority to court and said, we have a right to this particular house. You can't move us on. And the Greens in New South Wales have confirmed that that's their hope is that the same provision in New South Wales will be binding on public housing authorities. Now, the thing is, though, it doesn't apply on kind of the 90-something% of housing that's provided in New South Wales by non-public housing authority, and therefore it only protects a very small part of the society, and in the ACT case actually has led to the reduction of public housing stock because of the rights of the three against the many who otherwise would have benefited, even when it was the government's clear intention to say we're actually trying to increase the number of people who can have access to housing that was being stymied by the individual human rights. So there's an example of how that was actually applied.
Another novel one, I would think, and it's not novel in the sense that we've heard it before, but there's a provision in here that's very, very similar to the voice referendum and the language of the voice.
That's right.
And look, we can agree that people can have different views on that, but the idea that something that went down in a referendum just a couple of years ago will now be implemented and legislated, or potentially legislated here in New South Wales, and again, so that every piece of legislation, every act of a public authority has to be read through
That's right.
the language of the voice.
First Nations people need to be consulted in matters that impact them, and so this gives them a special standing to be able to require consultation under Section 49, and if they don't, under Section 50, to take that matter to a court or a tribunal. And so, if anything, this creates more power than the voice as it was proposed would have.
And from my read, it's not only about First Nations people, but you've got women need to be consulted on decisions that...
Everybody needs to be consulted about matters.
Children, LGBTQ people, all of these different categories need consultation. So it's not only just a voice for First Nations people, it's a voice for LGBTQ people, for children, for women. I'm not sure there's a voice for people of faith in there.
We kind of missed out on that.
We don't get consulted. I mean, I get consulted because I'm a woman.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I think you miss out on probably all of those, Bishop Michael. So it's the voice expanded and then multiplied across a whole range of
and you can just see it's going to
protected groups.
It's going to grind the government's public authorities' abilities to make decisions because of the endless requirements of consultation, and then the potential for a tribunal and court action in order to be heard. Now, so that's a problem. You have novel rights like the right to preschool education and university education. So how does that work? So I didn't get into university, so I sue the government because the entry mark was too high. It's some of these rights, you just think they're unworkable.
And also, I didn't go to preschool because my parents made a decision otherwise. Does someone get to come and advocate on my behalf that I should be forced into preschool? And actually, it's an interesting thing because it takes away then the rights of parents to make decisions for their children. And one of the things that I noticed, we talked about novel rights, but then rights that have been excluded. So the ICCPR gives a right to a parent to have a child educated in accordance with their morals or beliefs or things like that. And that's just been completely cut out.
That's right.
In
the whole
this bill.
in international covenants, there's a very careful balancing between the rights of the child and the rights of the parent, and it recognises both. And there is a kind of sliding scale for the very young child. It's the parents primarily who are deciding what's in the best interests of the child. This act goes the other way. It very much moves to what in other parts of the legal world are known as the mature minor approach. And so if this child is able to make decisions for themselves, then they have the autonomy and the right to do that, independent of the rights of the parent. And so the ICCPR Article 18.4 is completely and obviously missing from this. It's just demonstrating that ideological bias against parents having a say in what is actually in the best interests of children.
Yeah, there's a real undermining of parents and also of the family, because one of the other things that it does is it redefines the family to mean basically anything, because you have a right to your family, but then family can mean parents, it can
kinship
mean
group,
kinship, it can mean chosen family and all of these types of things. So it dilutes the definition of family to actually...
It redefines family.
Redefines family in a way that then leaves the actual, the nuclear family unprotected, because it says the nuclear family is basically just one form of any type of chosen family structure and doesn't require any further protection or any special protection, which again we know is just terrible for the building of the individual and the building of society. There's a reason. Yeah,
there's a reason why families are protected in international covenants, because we realise they are the fundamental building block of society. And this is a bill that's anti-family.
Absolutely. Anti-faith, anti-family. What else have we got?
There's other things. It fails to protect rights which are in the ICCPR, and as I said, it alters the ICCPR rights. So there's it redefines what torture means. So some actions which are not torture under international law will suddenly become torture, and so there'll be arguments about whether degrading treatment is torture and things like that. And so we're going to have debates about novel ways of people creating complaints against other people by saying what you did was unfair. It now is going to be given new labels by using this bill.
Yeah, now what you did was torture.
Yeah.
We should just touch on, we've been talking a lot about the obligations on public authorities, but we're yet to define what a public authority is.
Okay, so let's focus on that. So you would think that public authority means government authority, but it doesn't mean that. It does mean that, but it means any private institution which is effectively providing a public service, and not necessarily, but certainly those who are getting any kind of public funding for it. But what does that mean in practice? It means that private religious educational institutions, schools, universities. It means religious hospitals. It means other kind of social welfare agencies which are run on a consistent with a religious ethos. All of those things are now public authorities for the purposes of this act. And so it means that the kind of enforcement provisions that I talked about earlier are also binding on these institutions. So a Catholic hospital, somebody could make complaints against the Catholic hospital because they haven't been consistent with these overriding rights that are upholding human dignity and freedom, and it might be because they fail to provide certain medical services which are inconsistent with Catholic religious beliefs.
And by medical services, what you're really saying is they refuse to kill people, either the unborn or the elderly.
That's right.
Really, that's what we're talking about.
We're talking about abortion and euthanasia, and people will say, well, you've contravened my rights, I'm going to make a complaint. You didn't take my concerns into account, so I'm going to institute something through the courts. We'll talk about what you can do in the courts in a moment. Or I can just institute a complaint, and then the New South Wales Human Rights Commission will conduct an inquiry into the Catholic hospital.
And actually, the Human Rights Commission doesn't need to wait for a complaint, because one of the powers it's got here is just of its own idea. It can say, well, you know what, we're pretty sure that Catholic hospital isn't acting in accordance with human rights. We're just going to go and do our own little investigation and get them to come and appear before us. And do things like that.
And can compel evidence from anybody who might have relevant information. So not just that Catholic hospital over there, but any Catholic hospital. In fact, anybody else that they think might have relevant information, they have powers to compel, to require people to appear and to produce information, to produce documents.
One of the interesting things in terms of the definition of a public authority, it's that have the perception of sort of being a government or, a government-provided service or a service that people would expect the government to provide. And I always think about marriage, because we expect that the solemnisation of marriages is really the job of the state, and we have to register marriages with registry. And so you could even come and say, well, actually the way that religious bodies conduct marriages could be under the eye of a human rights bill.
Yeah, and although they can't override another piece of legislation, they can make a declaration, look, this is inconsistent with the Act. They can name and shame institutions who aren't compliant with the Act, because there's no clear description of how this Act interacts with, say, exceptions or exemptions in the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act. And so its powers to name and shame institutions, it can exercise those as a way of public shaming. Whether or not you can prosecute somebody for breaches, they can still do a lot of damage to these institutions at a public level. So public authority means much more than you think it means. But that's not the only avenue of enforcement, because there's also through the courts. What's the deal with what the Act says about the courts? Or do you want me to fill that one in? Yeah.
Why don't you do that one?
Yeah. So the Act says that the courts are now required to interpret every piece of legislation, so not just human rights legislation, but every piece of legislation as consistently as possible with the obligations in this Human Rights Act. And so you could have an unrelated regulation under some planning zone that somebody says, well, actually, this is inconsistent with my right to water, to clean water, because the EPA pollution here, the EPA Act doesn't sufficiently guarantee me a right to water, and suddenly an act which is designed to do the very thing, that is clean water, that the government has instituted, is now being reinterpreted in light of this statutory requirement of a minimum standard of clean drinking water. And so the court, and even if on the face of it, it's actually inconsistent with the right. So even if the Act said, no, this doesn't, the courts are required to interpret it inconsistent with the original intention.
Which means that, I know we're both nerdy lawyers at heart, but the whole idea of being able to rely on precedent, to be able to predict the outcome of a court decision based on previous decisions, based on the wording of the legislation, the second readings, the minister's second reading speech, all of these things that they teach us in law school about how to interpret legislation, then suddenly get thrown out the window. Absolutely. Or at least deprioritised for this new sort of subjective human rights analysis.
That's right. What is the plain reading on the face of the legislation is no longer what it necessarily means, and you don't know in advance what some judge is going to decide that it means, because they're going to weigh up this very subjective test of whether this is a right which is reasonable and can be demonstrably justified in all the circumstances on the basis of freedom, equality and dignity. That's a very woolly test.
And part of the sort of the idea of justice and natural justice is that laws should be predictable, and that we should actually understand how the laws that we're being asked to abide by will be interpreted by the courts. And so again, in this idea of this, this bill is being sold, and bills like it get sold with this idea of, well, actually we're here to protect your human rights. It's taking away not sort of the most fundamental right of the right to life, but also the right to natural justice, which is itself a fundamental right of anybody in a free and fair society.
Yeah. Now, we're getting short on time, but the last thing I want to talk about is the new bodies that are created. There's a new parliamentary scrutiny body, which, again, I think is just unnecessary because they've already got a body. But the one I'm really concerned about is the New South Wales Human Rights Commission. Now, why should I be worried about yet another statutory authority?
Well, look, I think anyone who's been watching human rights commissioners before parliamentary inquiries in recent weeks might might wonder about sometimes the logic that applies to these bodies. But the body will be taxpayer funded,
yep.
Staffed and resourced in a way where they're supposed to be not only dealing with complaints that come in, that's one part of their brief, but also to go looking for complaints.
That's right. So it's not just a complaints body, it's actually an ideologically enforcement body. It's saying our job is to create a culture of human rights, and so we're going to actually go out, and we have power to go out and investigate bodies where we think that they are public authorities where they're breaching human rights.
Or we think they might be.
Yeah.
And go on
witch hunts.
Witch hunts, I was going to say fishing expeditions, but, arose by any other name. But yeah, they could go and they could say, okay, well, we think that the Anglican school system is probably a place where there's going to be some form of, discrimination and things like that. So we're just going to go and we're going to ask for board papers and internal things. You can, I think, resist on the basis of legal professional privilege, but everything that's not legal advice, basically they have the authority to come in and subject, I think, to something like an $11,000 or $12,000 fine every time you decline to provide documents or provide information. And you can only, the other thing that was interesting is that you can only, you must be sort of self-represented at the commission unless they give you permission to be represented. So you'll have...
Well, except that there's a real bias. So if you're the respondent, you need permission to have anybody in the room with you. But if you're the complainant, you could have up to 5 individuals in the room with you. So you can have a support person. You can have somebody who is going to speak on your behalf. So they're acting as because you're obviously traumatised and not able to speak for yourself. And then you can have a representative, and you can have a translator. There's a 5th person. I can't remember who that 5th, but yes, you could have 5 people in the room with you to help you make your complaint.
So I think that's an extraordinary amount of power that they have. And look, I don't like to be cynical, but I'm certain that if you have a Human Rights Commission that's set up, taxpayer funding, that's been told non-discrimination is the primary right that we want to protect. Now, you go out and take a look at some institutions or some public authorities where you think discrimination might be occurring. I'm pretty sure they're going to be knocking on your door and they're going to be knocking on our door. So I'll say, we're sure that those religions, they discriminate against people, and we're going to get in there and we're going to have a good look. So that's the own investigations, but I want to talk a little bit about the process where a person can actually make a complaint. Because one of the interesting things that I find too is how they arrange the costs. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the costs are very much so it's a no cost to the complainant, and so that effectively that's going to be funded, or all of that process is going to be funded by the government, by us, by taxpayers, but they have the power to award costs against the respondent, and so you're the respondent who's going to be able to who's going to be on the hook for this.
So I can make a complaint and it's completely risk-free for me.
Yeah.
But whoever I'm making a complaint against not only has their own costs of complying with this particular process, but then also could potentially be on the hook for my costs as well. Not that I've incurred any costs, but the taxpayer cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's extraordinary. So we're out of time, so let me see if I wrap it up. Is it a good bill or a bad bill?
It's a terrible, terrible, terrible bill. They're coming to get your faith, they're coming to get your family, they're coming to get you, Bill.
Yeah, that's right. Human rights bills are problematic on the whole. This one is the worst version of what is a bad idea. So there are opportunities to make submissions. Submissions close on the 3rd of July. There will be an ongoing process when it gets to the end of the parliamentary inquiry stage. That's really to watch where it goes. Our hope is that the government and the opposition will just oppose this out of the blocks, and that it won't get any further in the legislative process. But if not, it may well be something that we really need to speak to our local members about.
Absolutely. And look, can I be a little bit political here and say we are in an election year?
Yeah.
And so if there's a time to make your voice known and your thoughts about this particular bill to your local MP, it might be around the same time that they're asking for your vote.
Indeed, it might be. Monica, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Freedom Matters. We'll see you next time.